Well, welcome to week one of CS394R Applied Probability. In this lecture, we're going to be going over probability models and axioms, and basically that's just a high-level understanding of what goes into probability. So by the end of this lecture, there's a couple key takeaways. So the first item that we're going to cover is what a probabilistic model is. And basically a probabilistic model is a quantitative description of a situation, a phenomenon, of some experiment for which the outcome is ultimately uncertain. And so our goal by the end of this course is to be able to put a description, a definition of what the outcome of that type of situation would be with some percentage accuracy. And ultimately, that's what a probability is. It is the likelihood of a situation occurring. So we will discuss how to create probabilistic models. And ultimately, we'll find that's a two-step process where we define a sample space and ultimately decide what the likelihood of each object within that sample space is. The next thing that we'll talk about in this lecture is defining the axioms of probability theory. So an example of that would be that a probability cannot be negative. Now, in probability, there's not a ton of axioms. There's not a bunch of those fundamental rules that ultimately identify what a probability can or cannot be. But those axioms that do exist are incredibly powerful and ultimately can have a lot of consequences in the way that we define a probability. We will also see that there's a lot of other properties that are implied by those axioms, but they aren't necessarily part of those axioms. And then we'll finish up this lecture with a few examples that will ultimately involve models of either discrete or continuous outcomes. Now, discrete outcomes are much easier conceptually for us to understand because there aren't as many options. There aren't as many potential outcomes for that probability. Continuous models ultimately involve much more sophisticated concepts. We'll point out some of the issues associated with that, but the majority of this course is going to be focused on discrete probabilities rather than continuous probabilities. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what the big picture of probability is, how probability plays into our day-to-day lives, and ultimately its relation with the real world. That's ultimately what we're going to cover through this lecture, so let's dive right in.